Earl Whitaker had farmed the same 80 acres outside Cedar Falls, Iowa, for 31 years, and he liked to say he could plant corn in his sleep. That autumn, though, sleep was exactly the problem. His wife Donna had been in and out of the hospital for a hip surgery, and between driving her to appointments and running the farm alone, Earl was running on fumes. It was a gray October evening when he pulled into the co-op to pick up his usual load of nitrogen-rich fertilizer for the winter wheat. The regular supplier, a heavy-set man named Gary who'd known Earl for 15 years and could practically read his order off the top of his head, was out sick that week. In his place was a young man barely out of high school, new to the job, and clearly still learning where everything was kept in the sprawling warehouse behind the co-op office.
"Whitaker, right? 80 acres, corn and wheat rotation?"
the young clerk asked, flipping through a clipboard. Earl nodded, only half listening, his eyes drifting to the phone in his shirt pocket in case the hospital called about Donna. The clerk disappeared into the warehouse and came back a few minutes later with a forklift, 2 pallets stacked with heavy paper sacks.
"That's you,"
the young man said, tapping the invoice. Earl signed the ticket without reading it closely, his mind still on Donna's discharge papers sitting on the passenger seat of his truck, and on the fact that he still needed to stop by the pharmacy before it closed. He thanked the clerk, climbed into the cab, and drove the 20 minutes home in the dark, thinking about anything but fertilizer. The next morning, exhausted and moving on autopilot, Earl mixed the fertilizer into his spreader and worked the north field before the sun was even fully up. It wasn't until he was halfway through the second pass that something nagged at him. The granules looked different, coarser, almost silvery in the early light. He stopped, climbed down, and checked the bag stacked in his truck bed. His stomach dropped. The co-op had given him the wrong blend entirely. A specialty potassium and micronutrient mix meant for a neighboring vineyard operation, not corn ground. It contained none of the nitrogen his wheat needed, and instead was loaded with trace minerals: boron, zinc, magnesium, and a touch of sulfur, all balanced for grapevines, not grain. Earl cursed under his breath. He'd already covered nearly 6 acres. Replacing it now would cost him money he didn't have, and calling the co-op to complain would only delay things further with winter closing in fast. He decided to finish the field with what he had, made a note to buy the correct fertilizer for the rest of the farm, and told himself he'd probably just lose that section of the crop. He didn't think much more about it until spring. When the wheat came up, Earl noticed the 6 acres looked different from the rest of the field, greener, thicker, with stalks that stood taller and straighter than anything else on his land. He figured it was a fluke, maybe better drainage in that corner of the field, and kept an eye on it through the growing season. By June, the difference was impossible to ignore. The mistakenly fertilized section wasn't just healthy, it was thriving in a way Earl had never seen in 3 decades of farming. Earl, a little embarrassed, told him the truth: the mix-up at the co-op, the sleepless nights, the wrong pallets. Hank laughed so hard he had to lean on the fence post.
"You're telling me your best crop in years came from a mistake?"
By harvest time, the numbers didn't lie. The 6 acres treated with the vineyard blend yielded nearly 40% more grain per acre than the rest of Earl's field, with kernels that were larger, denser, and higher in protein content when tested at the local grain elevator. The stalks had resisted the early blight that had knocked back yields on several neighboring farms that year, and the roots, when Earl dug a few up out of curiosity, ran deeper and more branched than he'd ever seen in wheat. News of the anomaly reached the Extension Office at Iowa State University, where a soil scientist named Dr. Patricia Reyes had spent years studying micronutrient deficiencies in Midwestern soils. She drove out to Cedar Falls herself, skeptical that a farmer's accident could outperform carefully calibrated agricultural science, but curious enough to see it firsthand. She arrived on a cool morning in late September, driving a university pickup loaded with soil probes, sample bags, and a laptop she set up on Earl's tailgate. Earl walked her out to the field himself, pointing out the visible line where the wheat changed from ordinary to extraordinary, almost like someone had drawn it with a ruler. Dr. Reyes crouched down, rubbed a handful of soil between her fingers, and asked Earl a string of questions about his usual fertilizer routine, his crop rotation, and how long he'd farmed the land. Earl answered as best he could, feeling a little like a man being questioned by a doctor about symptoms he hadn't known he had.
"It's not magic,"
Dr. Reyes told a local reporter who picked up the story for the county paper.
"It's a lucky accident that exposed a blind spot in how we fertilize row crops around here. We optimize for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but we don't always look closely enough at trace minerals. Mr. Whitaker's mistake gave us a real-world experiment we couldn't have designed better on purpose."
The story spread beyond the county paper. A regional agricultural journal ran a feature on Earl's field, and within a year, extension offices across 3 states were fielding calls from farmers asking about micronutrient testing. Fertilizer companies took notice too, and at least 2 regional suppliers began offering blended products that included the trace minerals Earl's accidental mix had highlighted. Earl himself became something of a minor celebrity at farm equipment shows and county fairs, always a little sheepish about the attention. He'd get up on stage at agricultural conferences, scratch the back of his neck, and tell the same story. Exhausted, distracted, grabbed the wrong pallets, and forgot to double-check the bags.
"I'm no scientist,"
he'd say.
"I just didn't want to waste what I already paid for."
But underneath the humor, there was something the experts couldn't ignore. Earl's accident had done more to advance local understanding of soil micronutrients than years of controlled trials, simply because it happened at full field scale, on real working land, under real weather conditions no laboratory could replicate. Donna recovered fully from her surgery that year and liked to tease her husband that his best crop ever came out of a season when he could barely remember what day it was. Earl would just shrug and say the wheat didn't seem to mind. The co-op, for its part, quietly updated its inventory procedures so pallets meant for the vineyard supplier wouldn't end up on a grain farmer's truck again. But Earl asked them, half joking, to leave a few bags of that same blend aside for him each season. He wasn't about to argue with results. 3 years later, Earl had converted a full 20 acres to the mineral-enhanced fertilizer program, working alongside Dr. Reyes's team to fine-tune the ratios for his specific soil. The yields held steady, well above his old averages, and the protein content of his wheat earned a premium at the elevator that more than paid for the extra cost of the specialty blend. Standing at the edge of his field one September evening, watching the combine roll through stalks heavy with grain, Earl thought back to that groggy morning at the co-op, signing a ticket he never should have signed without checking it twice. It had felt like just one more thing going wrong in a hard season. Instead, it turned out to be the thing that finally went right. He never did tell Dr. Reyes, or the reporters, or the crowd at the county fair, that some nights he still wondered what would have happened if he'd caught the mistake before spreading a single bag, or if Gary had been at the counter that evening instead of a nervous young clerk still learning the warehouse. Would he have ever discovered what his soil had been missing all those years? Or would he have kept doing what he'd always done, wondering quietly why his yields never quite matched his neighbor's best seasons? Some things, Earl decided, you don't get to plan. You just have to be paying enough attention to notice when a mistake turns into something worth keeping. And after 31 years of farming the same 80 acres, that was a lesson he figured was worth more than any fertilizer, right or wrong. Donna, watching him from the porch as the last light faded over the wheat stubble, thought it was probably the closest thing to poetry her husband would ever say out loud, and she loved him all the more for it, mistakes, wheat, and all, every last golden kernel of it.